A question I've been getting a lot since 1.5 dropped is how do I evaluate what makes a good core unit? What are the things that I should be looking for? Are there points levels that I should be thinking about? So let's have a look at the general premises that I pick through. This video is brought to you by the Close Order Coaching Patron. If you're interested in more information than you can get on a Fix My List, or you're looking to work on specific aspects of your game that maybe I haven't covered in a video, this is the place to do so. Coaching comes in two tiers, either a one-on-one, 1 hour chat where we can discuss list building, various aspects of your game, what you'd like to improve on, or a 3-hour coaching game where we can go more in depth onto certain aspects. Both tiers come with a personal Discord channel where you can ask me questions, get list advice, or just plan out what we want to address in the next session. If you have any questions, you can ask on the coaching section of the Close Order Discord, and you can book my time anywhere from 9 AM to 11 PM local time, depending on the day. So, what makes core good? You could break this down into maybe, let's say, 4 different pillars to look at, but that would be arbitrary, and I think would only really be useful in terms of having a silly acronym that I can make you all say. So we're going to look at the 4 points that I think about when I'm looking at core. And first off, we're going to start with points. We're going to go into equipment, we're going to look at rules, and we're going to look at the role that the unit's going to look at. So when I'm thinking about core, all I do is per. And I think you should all start saying that because I think that'd be hilarious. Starting off with points, I wanted to start here because I think it's important to consider points, but there's a lot of different things to think about as to whether a unit is pointed well, and even if a unit isn't pointed well, if you need it in your list, if you need that role to be fulfilled for the playstyle you see envisioned in your army, you might just have to pay the points anyway. So I wanted to start with this because I think it is the least important to some degree. So if we look at, for example, Skeleton Warriors as like our benchmark, and this is a terrible unit to use as a benchmark because it's just incredible. You know, you're starting off, you've got your hand weapon shield, you're 4 points per model, you're undead, so you're unbreakable, you don't have to worry about psychology, you're never going to run away, which is for, if we're talking about scoring units, something like Skeleton Warrior Brick, 30 models, full command, coming in at 150 or less points, even after you put additional stuff on top of there. That's just a really high bar to meet, and it's very difficult to do so. So the sort of yardstick for what an ideal core unit is might look something like Skeleton Warriors, and it's very difficult to match up against them. And then if we go outside of the undead realm, you've got something like Yeomen at Arms, and Yeomen at Arms are, I've referred to them a lot of times now, as being the third undead army because they're so good. You can put Stubborn on there, you can put Shield, they've got Shield Wall, you've got 2 unit champions if you pay for them, so you can do the challenge out a unit multiple times trick that undead can do when they res their unit champion. The Yeomen at Arms can do the same, or men at arms if we're talking sort of grand army from Bretonians. There's a lot of really strong stuff in there, and again, this unit is probably too good for its points. You could probably afford to put them up to 6 points a model, and I'd still be very excited to put them in my lists. Skeleton Warriors could do with going up a couple of points. So we've got this very efficient baseline that we're sort of looking at in terms of points, and you kind of just want to throw that out the window. If you're not playing those factions, don't even try and compare what you're doing to those factions because you're not going to be anywhere near well. So I wanted to start off with the extreme end on one side and then go on to some other choices. So what other things do we have to look for or sort of worry about if we're looking at points as a point of comparison? Well, Dark Elf Warriors are 8 points per model, and Wood Elf Eternal Guard are 13 points per model, or if you give them a shield, 14 points per model. Now, you shouldn't compare between books in terms of my book does this, their book does this, but when we're comparing something that is an identical stat line, basically, because warriors are there might be a point of weapon skill in their difference or something like that for Eternal Guard, but sure, there's additional rules and stuff layered on top of them, but for what you want them to do, which is probably just buy a brick of them and stand on a point, they're not realistically going to catch anything. There is a huge discrepancy between the two there. 6 points per model is absolutely massive. Now, again, I'm saying that you shouldn't compare between books, but it's worth keeping in mind points if you see someone taking Dark Elf Warriors and doing well with them, you might then look in your book and go, oh, I've got Wood Elf Eternal Guard that can fulfill the same role. They've got very similar sort of equipment. They do the same sort of thing, and that's fair to say. But then when you look at the points, you can see that actually they're probably not going to do the same job. So my point about not comparing between books is sometimes you should compare between books, but if you're looking at, let's say I've seen one elf unit do one thing and I want my army's elf unit to do another thing, remember that actually points are important because there are some wild disparity swings between what they can do on the tabletop. And also, again, if you wanted a unit to just stand on a point the way that you might take Yeoman at Arms to do for 5 points, and you see someone bring 30 of those, 150 points before you start putting command on there, so let's call Yeoman at Arms 180 points for a brick. Maybe you're not excited to take the much more expensive Dark Elf Warriors at 8 points per model up to 30. So points are... You probably shouldn't compare them in terms of going one for one, my book can't do this, this makes me sad. But if you're looking at other armies, make sure that you're keeping in mind points when you try and work out if your army can do the thing that you've seen someone else do on the tabletop. That's my main point here. Secondly, when we're talking about points, you want to compare within book. And comparing within book, I think, is really useful. So Chaos Marauders come in at 6 points per model, so more expensive than the Yeoman, quite expensive there. 8 points per model if you give them light armor and shield, and that gets them to a 4-up armor save, which with parry I think is quite a good breakpoint. If I have the option to pay for light armor and shield, I'm often going to at least consider going for that. Shields, especially now that you get +2 to your save in combat with the parry save, is very, very strong. So Chaos Marauders coming in at 8 points per model for a T3 model with a 5-up save or a 4-up save in combat. You can give them full command. They've got a lot of good rules on top of there. That feels pretty good. And then you compare them to the other infantry unit that you can take in Warriors of Chaos, the base Warriors of Chaos book, which are Chaos Warriors, which come in at 13 points per model or 14 points per model with a hand weapon and shield. Now, obviously, there's a lot of reasons to take Chaos Warriors, but if I'm looking for something to score points without being too much of an investment, let's say I want to take a big unit of Chaos Knights, and I then want something to sit at home on my home objective, do I look at Chaos Warriors first? Maybe not. That's a really big points investment. Maybe I just look at a big brick of Chaos Marauders. 240 points for 30? Maybe we don't even go 30. Maybe we go 20 or 24. But you can sort of toy around with what points am I willing to spend to do this job, and then work backwards from there. So I think there's a lot of angles to look at points from. But to summarize, if you're looking between books, don't do that, it'll make you sad if you're not playing Undead or Bretonians. But if you're looking between books, don't use points as a sort of, their unit is this, mine is this, I should feel bad, but do use it as a, I can see they're using 150 points to hold the center. I think I want to do that. Oh, that will cost me 300 points. Do I think it's worthwhile? So you can compare using that way. But more realistically, use points to compare stuff within book. So if you've got something like 2 infantry units and you want them to play the role of holding your home field strategic location, maybe that's where points come in. You could go, I've got 150 points left in my list. What does that look like in terms of Chaos Marauders? You know, maybe that's 18 Chaos Marauders with a unit champion, or that would be much less, 11 Chaos Warriors, something like that. So it makes it a very easy point of comparison when you're looking within book. Finally, Longbeards. And this is just to go back to the point of comparison between books. So Chaos Warriors and Longbeards fully upgraded, or Longbeards with a great weapon and shield compared to Chaos Warriors with just a hand weapon and shield. You can see here, comparing between books, one of them is, I would say, significantly more attractive. The Longbeards are a much more appealing choice, but also you've got to think about that in context of the book, because the Longbeards are probably the best you can do in terms of core for a lot of dwarf lists, whereas Chaos Warriors have more mobile options. So again, just to reiterate back, if you're comparing between books, points aren't the only point of comparison. But I think it is worth talking about them and worth having that in mind, even if just to be, actively disregard them in some cases. Moving on to what I think is probably the second most important piece of the puzzle, but we're going to put it here because I think you need to know about this before you really move on to the role of what the unit is going to be. Equipment. First of all, most obvious, do they have armor and shields? If we think about the changes from, version 1 to 1.5, the main thing that is going to change in terms of core is parry saves, or just sort of general ability for infantry to not fall over immediately. If you've got light armor and a shield, you now have a 4-up save in combat. That's just respectable. It's not incredible, you still fall over to lances or whatever it is. But it's really nice to have a little bit of an armor save. Old World is different to Fantasy in that you're kind of capped at a -2 AP. Even if something's hitting you at strength 6, strength 7, it doesn't matter. It doesn't doesn't change the AP of the incoming attacks. So having AP2 Armor Vein 1 is sort of like the top end of the aggressive output that someone can bring to you. It just means that you're going to be getting a save, even if it's not a great save most of the time. By the time you're up to heavy armor and shield, you've got 3 up armor save. Previously, that was full plate and a shield, so you're pretty tanky, and being able to save a third of the wounds that are coming at you when someone hits you with, regular attacks from a great weapon or a lance, ignoring armor vein, that just gives you a good amount of survivability that previously you wouldn't have had. Now, that's not to say if you don't have armor and shield that you're completely useless, but it gives you a very clear defined role in my mind when you've got a unit that's relatively cheap and has a good armor save. Comboing with that, do they have other or multiple weapons? So as long as you've got armor and shields, you can probably play the role where you're going to be sat in the middle of the board, some sort of combat res brick or Death Star, something like that. You might want to bring other weapons as well, and a great example of this is something like Longbeards. So Longbeards can have armor and shield. They also have the option to bring great weapons for a point per model. So you've got a unit that when charged can just soak the charge. They've got hand weapon shield, they've got AP1 on their hand weapon attack, so it's a really good unit in terms of just sitting around and making sure that you don't don't fall over while still doing some damage back. Strength 4 attacks with AP1 hand weapons. That's pretty respectable for things that are attacking you when they charge, whether that's knights or what have you. But if they don't feel like they need to, use the hand weapon shields, maybe they are in combat with a cavalry unit, they didn't, they gave ground or something last turn, and the lancers aren't going to do anything to them because the knight unit has had to swap to hand weapons. Suddenly, you might just want to change to great weapons. Use them as a bit of a tin opening unit there. So having that other equipment also changes the use of it. A unit that can only soak charges with hand weapon shield, they might not be able to be that full Death Star unit, but they might be more equipped for like a combat res brick, where all you want to do is sit on a point, dissuade people from charging you, and then once they do charge you, you hit them in the flank with something else, whether you've got a dragon or some Pegasus knights or your own knights, whatever you've set up to protect your slower infantry units. Multiple weapons doesn't just include infantry weapons, melee weapons, I should say. Crossbows, a great example here. If we go back to dwarves, rangers. Rangers can have hand weapon, shield, great weapon, throwing axes, and they can also have crossbows. This makes it a very flexible unit. You can take a unit of, let's say, 16 or 20 rangers, put them off to the side of the board. You can have them holding a strategic location off on the side. You don't have to put a huge amount of investment into them. Given that they scout, they can start on objectives that are not in your deployment zone if you want to, which is very strong for a slower army like dwarves. You've got the range so that you're not just investing points to something that's going to hold an objective and not interact with the game in any way, shape, or form. This gives you a different dimension. Suddenly, this ranger unit that's got heavy armor, they've got shields, they've got great weapons, you probably don't want to run them as a Death Star or a combat res brock. You might want to run them off to the side, scoring as an independent piece that can just sort of hold their own. It's going to take a lot of investment for your opponent to get rid of them or to get them below unit strength 10, depending on what size unit you go for. And it gives you a different take on what a unit can do because it's got different equipment, different availability. Can you take full command? If yes, suddenly you're more likely to be pushed towards that sort of full ranked up brick. Maybe you can't. If we're talking something like Wood Elves, Dryads, they can only take unit champions. You're never going to get a huge amount of combat res out of that unit. You can tool them up in some ways to have some combat res out of them, but it's a lot harder for you to soak a charge from, let's say, a dragon when you can only get, a couple of ranks and infantry outnumber. You've not even got close order in that unit. So full command makes a big difference, being able to take standards, but then also being able to take magic banners. And this is going to vary army to army. You might be able to take cheap magic banners, you might be able to take mid-strength magic banners. If you can take 50-point magic banners, honestly, that's most of the banners in the game, most of the good ones as well. A lot of the expensive banners are not great. So, you might find that, I really want to bring a load of combat res. I've got this unit here that's got, close order, couple of ranks, infantry outnumber, full command. Let's put a war banner in there as well. Just +1 combat res. Or maybe I've got a banner that gives me ignores penalty for stand and shoot. Okay, cool. Maybe I want to have this more off to the side. And, you can think about how you're going to use it in terms of the equipment that comes with it. Very similar to the weapons, and it sort of all ties in together there. Also important to know is magic item allowance on champions. Now, most of the time, this is going to be 0 to 25 points. That's the core. There are a few exceptions where you can take up to 50 points in core on unit champions. Looking at you, Jade Lancers, and that might change your role from being, whether you're a harrying unit or a pressure unit or something like that. It might just change you to being a unit that carries Ruby Ring of Ruin and doesn't die and moves around in marching column, just, moving at normal speed, but fires Ruby Ring of Ruin, or brings the Alchemist Mask, which gives Plague of Rust as a bound spell. Like, that's a really strong way of using a unit, and it's magic item points that you don't have to put into your characters, and units you don't have to position to use that in a way, so you can get more out of your characters without having to put your Ruby Ring of Ruin. I don't want that on a Dragon Lord, for example. But if I can put it on a unit that is core or wherever, being able to bring that is useful in that I don't have to spend resources that I want doing other things. Because character points are usually going to be your heavy hitters. You're going to get a lot of kill points out of those. Next up, we've got rules. Now, this is probably the most important one in terms of how you think about the role. So I could have started with that, but I also wanted to get the other two out of the way because they do all feed into it. So what sort of rules are we looking for? Well, first of all, if you're looking for some sort of combat brick, whether it's Death Star or combat res brick, Stubborn and Shield Wall, incredible rules. You want to be able to take a charge on the chin, you want to not run away, you want to make sure that you stay on the objective, near the objective, set up so that you know where you're going to be able to countercharge if someone does come and hit your slower static unit with something fast like a unit of knights. So really good rules. Out of the two, if you can only get one, Stubborn is better. Shield Wall's really nice, but it combos better with Stubborn, because you still have to take a leadership test if you take Shield Wall. You just upgrade your fallback in order to a Give Ground, which is obviously better, but there is still potential for you to roll that dreaded 11 and lose your very expensive unit for very little cost. Warband and Horde. Again, this goes really well into that sort of scoring unit. There are some downsides here. Anything with first charge is going to turn off your leadership boost that you get from Warband, so do be worried about that in terms of if you've got something that's going to sit on an objective. If you've got Warband, Horde, and then also Stubborn as well, that's a really strong combination. Or having your general nearby so that you can always rely on that higher leadership when needed when you get charged by something with first charge. But Warband and Horde usually comes on cheaper units, so this is something that might be, more leaning towards that combat res brick. Horde, giving you a third rank of combat res. Just having you can, with Warband and Horde, as long as your opponent doesn't have first charge or disrupts you, you can be more off to the side. You don't have to be within your general's leadership range. You can use that as a secondary scoring unit. So really strong rules to have in combination there. Reserve Move and Feigned Flight. Feigned Flight's nice. Feigned Flight is nice to have. I find I don't use it that much. I value it highly on cavalry. I value it much less on infantry. I often don't want to fire and flee with infantry. That's yeah, and I guess fire and flee is another rule that we could put on here alongside Feigned Flight, because you kind of need the two to go together. But it's nice to have. It's not amazing. Reserve Move. Now, if you've got Reserve Move, that is very, very strong. And this gives you the ability to get out, do some damage, or to always be mobile. It gives you the potential to be a very strong bunker unit, because you can put a mage in there that wants to cast magic missiles. You move your movement, and then you move your movement again at the end of the shooting phase. So you still have a lot of mobility in there, but you're still able to shoot. Really strong. And that's going to be pushing you towards some sort of like avoidance or switch scoring style. Often it's going to be on light cavalry. That's the sort of thing that you're looking for. And either this is going to be comboed with like a 5-up armor save, or you might have no armor save at all, and you're really just relying on being behind terrain and being avoided as much as possible. In this sort of line of rules as well, something to mention is evasive. I haven't put it on here. Evasive's really nice to have. It's not something that I would think about heavily in terms of core, because core I often want to be on objectives at the end of the turn. So if you get shot and you evasive, fall back in good order away from the objective, that's not great, but it goes hand in hand with those squishier scoring units that you might have. Skirmish. Speaking of squishy, Skirmish is a fantastic rule, and I don't think people fully recognize how good Skirmish is for those cheaper scoring units. If you've got something along the lines of Peasant Bowman or Deepwood Scout, Empire archers, anything that wants to be, skirmishing, so they're -1 to be shot by ballistic skill shooting. You also probably want to touch them to some sort of light cover, or have them partially behind a building or behind a wall or something like that. You can very easily make these units -2 to be shot by ballistic skill shooting. At that point, when your opponent, who has also brought some Bretonnian peasant archers, for example, they're shooting at long range because you're in your deployment zone, they're in their deployment zone, suddenly shooting at -3, if they're hitting you on 6s or 7s, it's a really strong defensive ability that I think people overlook. They look at the stat line and go, oh, this is a T3 elf that is wearing no armor. It's going to die immediately. Maybe not. Maybe you can just lean on the modifiers to hit. Obviously, magic missiles are the enemy of these sorts of skirmish units that lean on skirmish as their defense, but magic missiles, not as good as they were. It's easier to dispel them, it's harder to cast them, it's less of a worry now, and I think having skirmish is a really strong rule in terms of being able to stay alive on objectives. Drilled. Now, I like drilled, and this is something I've put down the bottom because I don't think it really sets your role. Drilled, I think, is fantastic on cavalry. It's decent on infantry, depending on what sort of infantry you have. If you have access to a second move, that is the strongest way to do it. So, you can march in marching column, and then you can use your second movement drilled out into just a regular close order shape. That's a really good way of doing it. I think I maybe undervalue drilled, but it's definitely worth looking out for. If it's free, amazing. If you have to pay for a point for it, consider it. If you have to pay 2 points for it, probably never bother. But it's a good rule. So look at that, and you can use this as a more aggressive way to get models up the board as well. So if you're going for something more Death Starry, having drilled is quite nice because you can get your very high points investment up the board on a more early get more out of them sort of basis. Finally, we have the important ones. We've talked about how to do your own scoring, but what about disrupting your enemy's scoring? And this is where first charge / counter charge come in. Cavalry with first charge, I think, are very, very good. And I'm starting to lean outside of core for these. I like having my core be the scoring units, and then maybe I go outside of core for the disruption pieces, the damage. So I'm talking stuff like Cold One Knights or Dragon Princes, both incredible heavy cavalry that you can't bring in core, but do eat core for breakfast. Those are really good. But there are some units that you can take in core that have this ability, and you don't have many better options to spend them on. I'm talking Chaos Knights, for example. Chaos Knights, very, very good. Not only do they have first charge, so they're good at disrupting enemy infantry, they've also got counter charge, which means that in the cavalry versus cavalry combat, you can bring, you get value out of them. You don't have to position super carefully. You can be more aggressive with them. You can put more pressure on to your opponent with them, which I think is a really strong ability to have with a core cavalry unit. Bretonnian Knights of the Realm. I don't love Knights of the Realm because I feel like they hit like limp lettuce, but you might bring them just as a secondary first charge unit, something that maybe your Pegasus Knights are going to get aggressive and charge something on turn 2. Maybe the Knights of the Realm don't charge something until turn 4, but because you've kept that first charge back, you're able to use that to maybe crack that big Death Star of Graveguard that you wouldn't have been able to crack otherwise. Something along those lines. But yeah, a really strong pair of rules. First charge is the really important one to have, but if your unit has first charge and counter charge, that's where it really sings. And I think counter charge is the spice that makes me really want to take core cavalry. Finally, out of the 4 arbitrary letters I've picked, we've got roles, and I'm going to talk about the vague roles that we have here, and there is overlap between them. But then I'm going to go through and give some examples and maybe discuss how you might use them as well to make it worth actually listening to. So starting off with roles, we've got Combat Res Brick. That's a cheap unit that's going to sit there, get Combat Res. You've got skeletons and stuff like that. Death Star. This is an upgraded version of the Combat Res Brick. The sort of unit that you have in a Death Star is going to want to have probably a decent chunk of combat res, but it also want to have defenses. You're going to want to put characters in there, whether there's a wizard giving out a ward save, maybe you've got a banner that gives them some level of defense, maybe you've got a battle standard bearer adding more combat res, maybe they've got some other layered rules on there. There's a lot of stuff that you can do with that sort of unit, and it's you're going to be taking basically 500 points of core, probably putting another few hundred points of characters in there, depending on the army that we're talking about. Secondary scoring. Now, this is a bit nebulous, but when I talk secondary scoring, I'm thinking of like light skirmishing units, you're taking 14 or 15 of them. You're putting them over to the side of the board. I've paid 75 points for these 15 peasant archers. How long is it going to take you to get them to 9 models? Longer than you want. It's more investment. I'm going to have them touching a wood. I'm going to try and outrange a Ruby Ring of Ruin, depending on what you do with your deployment. I'm going to have a wizard there within range to dispel so that you're not just going to hit them with a free fireball. Something along those lines. This is minimal investment in my mind. Depending on the army, the minimal investment might be a lot more points, and you'll see as we get to the examples. But it's minimal investment that's going to sit off to the side, try and interact through some sort of range shooting, or if you don't have that as a choice, maybe you're just a cheap unit of infantry with, let's say, light armor and shield in marching column, sat by a baggage cart, or sat by strategic location, something like that. Mobile switch scoring. Don't have a better name for this one. I probably do need a better name for it. Something pithy that rolls off the tongue. But this is your fast cavalry with reserve move, anything that can sort of sit in your deployment zone, or maybe it's going to move up into the middle of the board, get that strategic location, going to use its reserve move to do some damage and then get behind the terrain, or to get round the corner of the enemy unit that's maybe your opponent's marched 30 skeletons up to an objective, and you go, oh, actually, you're only 3 inches away from the objective. I'm going to put some Glade Riders there, just out of your charge arc. I'm going to take it away from you. Make it so that you have to waste time getting close to the objective, whatever that may be. So that's the sort of role that you have for the switch scoring, and that's going to be a unit that often sits around the edges. It's also going to combo often with being a bunker for a character. Aggressive anti-scoring. This is what we were talking about in terms of Chaos Knights, or if we were going outside, of course, stuff like Dragon Princes and Cold War Knights. Their job is not to stand on objectives and score. Their job is to take you off an objective, and sometimes the core points are the way to do that. Some armies don't have great sort of static scoring themselves, so they want to make sure they're interacting with their opponent on your own turn, trying to take them off the static scoring before they get too much of a points lead. Something like that, Chaos Knights. Any cavalry with first charge is a good place to look for that. Pressure. This is one that I threw in because not everything is going to fit in the other roles. Some units are not going to be able to score. Chariots, Razorgore, these are good examples of things that you're just going to put out, try and send them forwards, put pressure on your opponent with using them, but it's not a unit that's going to score or really be like aggressive anti-scoring. You're just going to use it to be like, okay, I've got a chariot that's going to go up and support with my knight, for example. Something along those lines. Finally, we've got bunker/escort units, and this is going to be the sort of thing like, for example, I like putting a Wood Elf Mage inside a unit of Glade Riders, because reserve move is an incredible rule. There's lots of good stuff that you can do here. Yeoman, Mounted Yeoman, Goblin Wolf Riders, anything with reserve move is really good for it, but fast cavalry in general is not bad, and you want some level of defense or redundancy in there, so these units are often going to be looking to pick up unit champions, and probably musicians as well. And we'll talk about command as we go through on the other examples. Apologies for the camera issues, it should be back up and running. So let's go through some examples of each type of unit as I see it, but also how I would think about using them, what sort of unit sizes, what sort of command I'd be putting on those as examples as well. So we'll start off with the Combat Res Brick. What is this role? It's something that's not too expensive in the context of your army, that you probably want to take quite a few models, that brings a lot of combat res, isn't necessarily great in combat, but it gets there through having maybe stubborn, maybe it's got shield wall, it's just got a lot of combat res, so it's hard to interact with in that way, and you're going to sit at an objective and not have to put too much investment into for it to score you 360 points over the course of the game by holding a strategic location or something like that. So what are good examples here? Well, first of all, veteran state troops with the Empire Griffin banner. State troops are relatively cheap. They come with some great rules. Veteran, great rule. Didn't mention it previously. If you can get veteran on your core, you shouldn't be able to, frankly. It's a ridiculously good rule. Just having rerolls on all leadership tests outside of break tests is very, very good, and it gives you a lot of resilience. So really good stuff there. But what do you get from the Empire Griffin banner? So you take veteran state troops, you're going to take probably around 30. You can go a little bit lower, a little bit higher, but 30 is a good number. You're going to give them full command. You're going to give them the magic banner, the Empire Griffin banner. This gives you +2 combat res for every rank, which means that you're bringing, because the unit's got Horde now as well, 6 static combat res from having ranks, 1 static combat res for being close order, 1 for being having a standard, and then probably 1 for infantry outnumber as well. The things that are charging you are probably not going to be larger than you. So you're going to be sat at a static combat res of about 9 before any casualties, which is very, very strong. You don't even need to put any investment into it, but you can put a wizard in there to give them a ward save, and sort of have it as a mix of a combat res brick and a bunker. Or you could put a battle standard bearer in there to give it more, rerolls to break tests, just have more static combat res, all of that good stuff. But, this is the sort of thing I would think for a combat res brick. What's another one? Skeleton warriors, whether that's vampire counts or more likely tomb kings. Vampire counts have other options. You're looking at about 30 models. You're going to go full command. You're going to have a lot of combat res there. You've got 3 ranks from Horde. You've got close order for a 4th point of you've got standard for a 5th point of combat res. You've got infantry and number for 6. You're sat at 6 static combat res. You're going to never break and flee because you're undead. You might take something like Nicarian Phalanx, sorry. So as long as you're not double outnumbered, which again, you're taking a lot of models, you don't even give ground. You just stand still when you lose combat. So this is a very strong defensive unit again. And the job here is stand on an objective, tie up the opponent when they charge you, give you an option to bring your heavy hitters to bear. That's the sort of thing you're thinking the combat res brick. Men-at-Arms and Yeoman Guard, very similar. They've got shield wall built in. They can get stubborn a few different ways. You can potentially put a magic banner on there. They've got Horde, they've got Warband. They're just a very cheap static combat res brick. They've got 2 unit champions, so they can challenge out enemy dragons twice. Your turn, their turn. Their turn, your turn, I should say. There's just a lot of really strong stuff in there, and I think that's worth playing around with for Bretonnian players especially. And again, their job is be cheap, stand on objectives, have static combat res so things can't just walk up and take them. A dragon can't charge this unit in the front because it's going to win on combat res 10 times out of 10. You just want it to be there, and then when something does charge you in the front, you might have your Pegasus Knights in range to go for the counter charge, so you can bring the pain, make it so that they don't even get anything out of it. Clan Rats, not a great unit, but they're super cheap in terms of what they bring. Put a shield on them now, whereas you previously wouldn't do. You've got a 4-up armor save in combat. They bring some static combat res. This unit, if you're playing just sort of regular Legacy, you have to take 1 unit per 1,000, so you might just stay at the 20, but going up to 30 is pretty decent, just for the same reasons as all of the other bits and pieces. You're looking for some cheap static combat res, and Skaven Clan Rats are pretty cheap. Warriors and Spearmen for Dark Elf and High Elf, respectively. If you are looking for some static combat res for Elves, this is the cheapest you can go. 8 points per model for a Dark Elf Warrior with a hand weapon shield. That's just decent. Spearmen they either come with shield wall built in, or they can buy it for 10 points. You do pay a point per model more, but again, you're just looking at cheap, and I'm saying 8 or 9 points is cheap for Elves, but you've got cheap units that can sit on objectives and not really provide any value other than just being there to soak. But both armies can have very good dragons, so maybe that's going to sit on your home objective. Someone tries to charge you with Chaos Knights, you just tank the charge as best you can, have the dragon go in and deal with the mopping up of the unit that charged you. That sort of jobby. Night Goblins, pretty good. They don't have any armor, so they die in droves, but they've got a shield, so now you get a 5-up save in combat. They obviously have a lot of other good things, so you might see these also tied into like the pressure style of list, but you want to go 30 with this unit. Why? You can only have 3 fanatics, and you have to have 10 Night Goblins per fanatic, so it's super easy to size a unit of Night Goblins. Take them in 30s. Probably give them full command, honestly. You've got enough static combat res in there that it's worth doing. And again, you're bringing them for the fanatics, you're bringing them for sitting on objectives, all that good stuff. Let's whiz through some other options. We've got Death Stars. Graveguard. This is a Death Star you might have seen. You're going to be taking sort of 28 Graveguard. They are super resilient. You're going to be giving them full command. You're going to be giving them the I think it's called Drakenhof Banner, the one that gives them +1 to their regen, so it's a 5-up regen. Now, with the way that Crumble works, they get a 5-up regen against the Crumble as well. This is just, such a resilient unit. It doesn't actually need that much support. You're going to put a white BSB in there, but you're probably not going to bother putting anything else in there. You're going to have characters or wizards nearby that can cast on them and res them, but this is a fairly standard Death Star. Probably going to be sitting around 26, 28. In the Tracing Warhost, White Lines. You can do a very good Death Star with White Lines. This is an open order unit, so it has a little bit less static combat res. It also doesn't have shields. It's only got a 5-up armor save from the heavy armor. With that in mind, this is the sort of unit that, again, you go full command, probably put War Banner on there. Just getting a little bit more combat res is really nice. I'd like to see this unit supported by wizards, by battle standard bearers. This is something that you want to put more infantry into because it gives you a lot more support. So quite a strong unit that you can pick there for high elves if you go down the Tracian Warhost. Doesn't really do the static combat res very well, more leaning on the character support and the killing. Any dwarf infantry brick, Longbeards, in my mind, are the best at doing it, but they do their Death Stars very well. You can use them as a combat res brick, especially if you go more warriors, which is cheaper. You don't have to put as much investment into, but you can put, the king that can kill a god in there with his Rune of Smiting, great weapon, and his 2-up armor save, and is immune to multi-wounds and killing blow. You can put your battle standard bearer that gives the entire unit 5-up ward save in there. Dwarf can do Death Stars very well. Orcs and Goblins, if you're going back into Orcs and Goblins, Black Orcs, you can take a unit of Black Orcs, probably take them in somewhere between 18 to 24, that sort of number, give half of them shields, so they've got that 3-up armor save, half of them great weapons, give them the big red raggedy flags, so they've got that weapon skill 5. Weapon skill, a rule that we haven't even talked about here, a really strong defensive ability is to not be hit on 3s or 2s if you're undead. And getting that plus combat res is really nice. Onto non-traditional units, if you're looking at Death Stars, if you're playing monstrous infantry, you can also bring Death Stars. Iron Guts, one of the ways that you'll be familiar with seeing ogres playing, is you take a huge unit of Iron Guts, take up most of your core, and then you just put loads of characters in there, and that's the main bulk of the list. The Gut Star is a pretty familiar sight for anyone who played Fantasy, especially through from 6. So, yeah, nothing new there, but even non-traditional core units can do a Death Star. And speaking of non-core, there are other things that you can bring. You can do, like, Cavalry Death Stars. Warriors of Chaos do Cavalry Death Stars very well, in my opinion. One of the best ways to run a Chaos Lord now is having him on a horse or on a demonic mount, depending on which version you want to go for. Both are pretty good. And you can bunker them within this unit, give them the Ogre Blade, they've got the ward save built in, and then because you're in a unit, you can also take 1 or 2 supportive wizards, maybe you'd go in Battle Magic to double move, giving them a ward save from Oak and Shield, maybe you're going for Demonology for the Demonic Vessel, Demonic Vigor rules, where you can get +1 strength, AP, and attacks. Chaos Knights with just +1 strength, AP, and attacks, that is a hell of a Death Star. You're getting 4 attacks from each model's frontage, which is very, very strong. You can crack a lot of things there, especially if you've got other support or characters in the unit as well. Moving on, we've got the secondary scoring units, and the sort of units that I'm expecting to see here is your Peasant Archers, Beastman Ungor, those really cheap units like Skeleton Skirmishers for Tomb Kings, Empire Archers, those cheap skirmishing units with longbows or warbows or whatever that are just going to sit off to the side, be touching a wood, always be -2 or better to shoot. That's a really good way to spend a small amount of points to try and secure, strategic locations that are off on the flank without having to put too many models over there. You can also take units that spend more points and are more effective, but still play into that sort of playstyle. Deepwood Archers. Obviously, you're looking, I think, 13 or is it 14 points per model by the time you've given them an arrow? 14, 15 points a model. Very squishy, completely naked. They're really just leaning on the fact that they've got skirmish, they've got evasive, so they're hard to shoot at. But this unit can sit pretty comfortably off on a flank, bring some value through range damage. Your opponent then probably wants to put more response towards them because they're scoring you points and they're worth a lot of points. But it's the sort of unit that you can get out of there quite easily. So it's a more expensive secondary scoring unit, but it's through the lens of Wood Elves, and Wood Elves don't have great secondary scoring units in terms of cheap stuff. Or you might be going Tracian Woodsman. Tracian Woodsman, also pretty expensive, but in return, they're a lot more flexible. They can fight off light units that come for them. If I get charged by some sort of light cavalry unit, I'm really not too worried. I've got, I've only got heavy armor. But then against shooting, non-magical shooting anyway, I've got the cloaks that give me +1 to my armor save. So it's a skirmish unit that's -2 to hit in a wood. I'm going to be rocking a 4-up armor save against bowfire. Again, the things that we're taking to deal with this is like the Ruby Ring of Ruin or Fireball. But as long as you've got some sort of wizard magic protection in your list, you shouldn't be too worried about that. Well, finally, the last sort of version of secondary scoring is for armies that don't have these skirmishy, light, cheap units. Stuff like Repeater Crossbowmen for Dark Elves, or even Rangers for Dwarves are really good at doing this. It is more of a points investment, and they are less mobile. They're probably going to be sat off on a flank. Obviously, Rangers can skirmish, but they I don't know that you do, given how slow they are. The change to when you were charged and losing models to skirmishes is pretty punishing. So I think a lot of the time you see Rangers ranked up. Anyway, I digress. These sorts of units are less mobile. They're probably going to be sat in close order or in open order, whatever they have, and they're going to be sat in 1 or 2 ranks, but they still do the same job. They're going to be sat off on the flank. But instead of maybe leaning on the defensiveness of having skirmish, they might have, in the case of the Dark Elves, they've got light armor and shield, so they've got a 5-up save. They've got a 4-up save in combat, which is not bad. Or the Rangers, which have got a 4-up save, they've also got toughness 4. So you've got different... You're leaning in slightly different avenues for your defensive stats if you don't want to go with something skirmishing. Then we've got what I've referred to as the mobile switch scoring, and that's going to be your fast cavalry. Usually it's got reserve move, or it's got some level of defense built in, like Dark Riders have light armor shield. This is a pretty one-note unit. If you have fast cavalry in your core slot, this is probably the role that it's going to take. It plays well around the edges of the board, but it's the sort of thing where you might be using it to move up and touch objectives that your opponent can't get to. Maybe you're stringing models round so that they're partially in cover and partially holding objectives, so that -2 to be shot from heavy cover. Maybe you're reserve moving out there. Maybe you're just sitting out of charge arcs if you're against a more infantry or melee based army. That's the sort of general premise that we've got here. Anything with reserve move works incredibly well as a bunk unit as well, but sometimes you just need to put a mage in a unit somewhere. So this is a good use for these, and there's not really a lot to say about them. Next up, we have got aggressive anti-scoring, and these really do what they say in the tin. We've kind of talked about these already. Warriors of Chaos, they've got first charge, they've got counter charge. You're going to push them forwards, you're going to try and charge your opponent's Death Star with them, deny them the rank bonus. That's the sort of thing that you're looking for. Just try and crack those infantry units, get them off the scoring. Knights of the Realm. Hit like they don't do any damage at all, but they are a good backup piece for your heavy hitters that come in the special and character slots. Gives you another first charge, so really nice there. Silver Helms, again, don't do a lot of damage, but can back up something like a dragon. You can have a unit champion there, so you're soaking a challenge that would take your dragon out of the fight, and also you're providing first charge, so you can really crush that unit of infantry. Empire Knights, this is a really good example of a scoring core unit that is kind of a flex unit in a way, in that you can have them running around and sitting on your own objectives because they're relatively cheap for what they do. You can give them drilled, you can give them stubborn, or you can tool them up, and one unit in every Empire army is going to be probably Knights of the White Wolf, unless they've gone for something different for a specific reason, because this unit's going to hit a lot harder. They've got that second attack from Furious Charge, so you can actually get in, and very similar to the Warriors of Chaos, you can not only turn off rank bonus with first charge, you can then on top of that do a lot of damage, get in, actually crunch the unit yourself. So it's aggressive anti-scoring without needing a huge amount of assistance as well. Something that's worth pointing out is not every heavy cavalry unit can do this. Jade Lancers, I don't think, are aggressive anti-scoring. Why? They haven't got first charge. They don't really have much damage. They're only strength 4, AP 1. I think this unit is more of a flexible bunker unit, or a unit for carrying magic items, or a support piece as opposed to a main line anti-scoring piece. We've got pressure as well, and we talked about these a little bit. This is the stuff that doesn't really fit into any of the other categories, but still wants to be aggressive. So Tuskar Chariots, Razor Gores. In Heralds of Darkness, you can take Chaos Chariots in core. They're unit strength 5. They're not going to score anything, but it's a heavy chariot. It's going to mess up infantry, so that's quite nice. In Warriors of Chaos, Chaos Knights. Night Goblins for Orcs and Goblins. And again, this is a multi-role unit in my mind. Night Goblins, not only are they combat res scoring, they bring pressure in that you can put them forwards aggressively, you can use them for board control, you can use them to try and push people off the objectives that they're on already. The longer you hold the Night Goblins, the Fanatics, the better. So the pressure that unit brings, I think, is a really key part in how I think about using them, and definitely worth considering when you're writing your list. Another example of this is the Skinks, and I don't know if I'd necessarily put them into pressure. I think they can do a lot of things. They are sort of like a switch scoring unit, but they march 12 inches and they can still throw their poison javelins. Poison's not as good as it was, but I think this is a really flexible unit, and you could argue that this is quite a good pressure unit, which is wild for something that is so unbelievably squishy and really only leans on numbers and skirmish to have any sort of resilience at all. Finally, we've got the bunker / escort units, and that's the sort of thing where you might be looking to put a wizard in. So if you've got foot wizards, Beastman Ungor, really good at doing this. If you've got a wood elf wizard on mage, sorry, wizard on mage, wizard on a steed, glade riders, you can move out, you can reserve move backwards, incredible. Empire Knights. You're probably not joining your wizard to the Empire Knights, but you might be running them around, whether they're in marching column and drilled, and then you've got the Pegasus characters nearby to protect them with lone character scoring. That's the sort of bunkering that I see Empire Knights doing. Marauder Horsemen for Warriors of Chaos. It's less common now to take Blaster Casters for Warriors of Chaos, but if you still want to do that, put them in a unit of Marauder Horsemen. That's pretty good. Mounted Yeomen. Just a great example here. You know, again, you can only take them in core and exiles, but you can put your outcast wizard in there if you wanted to go for like a battle magic wizard with a ruby ring of ruin, or maybe you want to move around the board, potentially score some points with the Yeoman, and then also have access to dark magic so that you can keep up with the Pegasus Knights and give them battle lust on a really key turn. That's the sort of key units that I'm thinking of when I'm looking at bunker / escort units. So at the end of that, have I defined every unit in the game and defined every role in the game? No, not at all. I don't think you can break the game down in that way. And I think if you limit yourself to that sort of rigid thinking, it will really harm your ability to adapt and to use units in other ways on the tabletop. However, I hope this sort of discussion is helpful in terms of what sort of unit should I be putting into my list for which roles? What sort of unit sizes are we going to be looking at for each role? What command am I going to be putting on here? Is there a use for this unit that I haven't thought about? Jade Lancers. Oh, actually, yeah, good point. They can take a Ruby Ring of Ruin. Great. Instead of trying to use them aggressively, maybe I do want to just take 6 and ride around the board. Fire off a magic missile now and then. Just make sure that I'm not losing my core points while also potentially moving in, touching some strategic locations, getting some secondary scoring there. So it's less of here is a prescriptive way for you to think, and more of hopefully a discussion that opens up a dialogue for how to start thinking about units if it's not something that you've looked at. Are there any ways of looking at units that you think that I've missed? Any sort of key roles that you use your units in a way that I haven't? One of the things that I've noticed is that everyone, well, not everyone, but there's a lot of different ways to play the old world because you're less tied down to objectives. We're a little bit more tied down now, but there's still a lot of flexibility. You don't have to get all of your points from standing on objectives. So if you want to be really aggressive, you can be, but you can also kind of dance around the board edges, get the points you need, try and eke out small wins. There's lots of different ways to play, and I think that's really interesting. So if there's any key roles that you think I might have missed, let me know down in the comments. Looking forward to seeing what you all have to say. Thank you for watching. Thank you for getting to the end of the video. If you've reached this point and you haven't already, I would really appreciate a like, a comment, a subscription if you haven't done those things. It just helps me get seen by more people, boost me up in the algorithm, all of the stuff that the YouTubers do like to say. If you would like to support me in my goal to become a full-time YouTuber, I would absolutely appreciate that. You can become a member below. There are various perks to those, name at the end of the videos, all that good stuff, but it also unlocks some VIP areas in Discord if you become a Longbeard or Ground Knight tier supporter. Those VIP sections are the only parts that are locked away in Discord. You don't have to be a member to join the Discord. I'd recommend that you should. We've got about 450, 500 people on there. It's a great place for discussion, a lot of fun. I do try and chime in as much as possible. And it's also where the Fix My List show lists are put, and also if you are one of the Grail Knight or Longbeard tier supporters, where you participate in choosing which list I play in the monthly Pick My List series.